Okay, welcome to the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer and developer of training for optimal balance. And with me is Deb Romero, orthopedic massage therapist and certified Alexander technique instructor. Today's topic is going to be beginning probably what will be several segments on Newton's laws of motion. And we both got headsets, so hopefully the sound is better. And we do call this a podcast because I don't want to have to do a background or visual aids. So the door goes to my garage in case anybody wants to know.
Where are you?
But we had to upgrade the sound because we call it a podcast, but we're not upgrading the visuals. Sorry. So the reason we wanted to kind of have some discussions about Newton's laws of motion, which are classical physics. There's 3 laws of motion in classical physics or classical mechanics. That are well established. It's how we put a man on the moon. It's what we call traditional physics, different than the more modern study of physics, which is quantum mechanics or quantum physics. But physics, even if you can't do the math, I cannot do the math, right? But we live in a physical reality. So understanding physics to just a rudimentary degree kind of helps us get away from overriding horses or following theories of training or riding or using our bodies that really work against the natural forces of motion that we describe in the study of physics. So the world is the world. Forces are happening all the time, movements happening all the time. Physics just describes how and why objects move or don't move. So it's directly related to riding because what we're dealing with as soon as we sit on a horse are the forces of motion. And then how would you say it relates to your work, Deb, with Alexander technique? And we'll go through each law, but just in general, how do you?
I think what really comes to mind to me is when I was just an orthopedic massage therapist, I could help people on the table that weren't moving. But as soon as they got up and started moving and had to deal with ground reaction forces, gravity, and then a stimulus of something they wanted to do, they had the possibility of not using themselves well. So that's when I moved into training with the Alexander technique, because we help people in movement to look at their movement and improve it. So it's that capacity that we are moving creatures, and to get better at movement, we have to do it in movement.
Right, because that's where the forces, there are some forces generated when we're stationary, but when we're moving, we have internal and external forces. And then if we put a living human on a moving horse, we have 2 moving bodies, plus all of the farther away forces like gravity that affect the forces of motion. So to kind of start off talking about this topic, because I would actually really like to make some of the laws of motion, which are one of the oldest parts of physics, developed by Isaac Newton. I would like to make science tangible, because the truth is we deal with it every day, whether we know it or not. So when we talk about cultivating balance, especially in the physical realm, like we've talked a lot about mental and emotional thoughts, feelings, forces, and that type of thing. But when it comes to physical movement, the essence of balance, the way I would best describe it, is an organization of forces into a direction, into a specifically directed rather than dissipating in multitudes, multiple different directions.
Mhm.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, kind of being in a container, which we are a container, and staying inside of those realms with all the forces that are coming at us.
And more specifically, if we think of balance, like balance is a point of stability between opposing forces, right? Which gets to Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But when I think of balance, what I'm helping the horse and rider do is resist dissipating, because we can say there's forces of motion in a general way. So when the body is dysfunctional, or when we're not optimally organizing our body or the horse, then the forces of motion kind of go in multiple directions. Like they might go more to the left than the right. They might go down and back instead of forward and up. We might get lean ahead of vertical or behind vertical, right? We might, when we use the reins, actually, a lot of times we're creating a backwards force rather than a resistance to a forward force.
Oh, I like that. That is actually, if you think about what humans do with their arms, a lot of it is a backward force.
A backward force,
Yeah,
exactly.
instead of leaving your arms on your back and
Right.
making it a forward force. I like that. Yeah.
Right. So the direction that is the same as what I work with horse and riders as the Alexander technique is that when you're managing your body most efficiently, the directions of force coalesce into kind of all going forward and upward.
Mm.
And so as the horse travels forward, when they lift their back, they're converting a portion of the forward force into vertical force. That's how they balance. That's how they flex the spine, lift the back. We also call it collection, engagement, lots of other terms, but that's essentially what happens. And so the forces of motion, when we're compensating or we're not in our best use, are going somewhere other than forward and upward.
They're going into a stressful situation is what they're doing. You know, say when you're teaching, I hear you say to some riders, you know, does one leg feel more tense than the other? And sometimes it's really hard for us to tune into that
Well, and
because
I think you find that with people even off the horse.
oh yeah, they and that's what's so great about having a teacher on the ground, as we say,
Mm-hmm.
is we may not be able to notice it in ourselves without having hands-on from an Alexander teacher or a riding instructor or whatever. We might not know.
Right. And like a simple common habit, say, of a right-handed person might be to excessively contract the entire right side of their body. And when they move, some of that forward force is with the contraction on the right, the force might be dissipating to the left as they walk forward. So instead of the forces of motion sort of coalescing into a straight line of force, it goes forward and slightly dissipates to the left because of the excessive habit of contraction on the right side of the body.
Exactly.
The other thing, working with horses, especially because they're big animals, and one of the concepts we have as riders is that when we give an aid, that we're sort of moving body parts around. Like
Wow.
we're moving the
Moving horse
shoulder.
body parts around?
Yeah. So
Okay.
like a leg aid, people say, I need to move the horse off my leg. And I go,
Okay.
what do you mean by that? And they mean flex the rib cage around my leg. So move the ribs, right? Or the horse dropping the shoulder. A lot of people use the rein to literally try to lift the shoulder,
Oh, like a manual device.
like a manual
Like
device.
I'm going to lift 11 to 1700 pounds off of that side. Okay.
Exactly.
Let
Right.
me know how that works for you.
Or push the hind legs underneath,
Mm,
or bring the horse's head and neck up with the reins. And I go, even though we're leveraged, that's really when what we think we're doing when we give aids on a horse, or maybe even you can describe it for people when they're reaching for an object, is that we think we're sort of pushing around body parts to get them in the right
mm,
mechanical coordination, when really the movement of the body is always also generating a force that has
yes.
direction and magnitude. So with horses, real sort of more advanced riding, which we can learn as beginners, if anybody ever bothered to show us, is that we can use our aids in a way that guides the forces of motion and let the horse figure out where the body parts go.
Mhm.
And so that's why I wanted to discuss Newton's laws of motion and how it relates to our riding experience very directly, because we are managing the forces of motion, trying to coalesce all of that energy or force into sort of one directive, forward and up, or forward and upward, forward and horizontal and vertical. So for the human, how do you like when you massage, is it more moving body parts, or is it
Wow, that's a
more
good one.
working with forces?
It can be both, but you have to take into context that the person is not moving and they're laying down. So those are two hugely different ways of dealing with force
Mm-hmm.
than when you're vertical, because once you're vertical, your brain's first function is I have to maintain vertical.
Right.
Yeah. So I imagine it's the same thing on the horse.
Well, and an interesting thing I was just sort of reading and studying up on is force is I didn't write this down for my notes today. Hopefully I remember this accurately, but force equals mass times acceleration,
Yes,
right? And that is actually one of Newton's laws. I think
that's the
it's the,
second one.
yes, it's the second one. So I'm working backwards.
Yeah, that's okay.
We will get to the first law in a second. So mass times acceleration equals net force, or the vector, the force vector. And what that means is the combination of mass times acceleration gives you the measurement of force, but it's a vector. So it always comes, force is always coupled with direction and magnitude. So the way I see that translating into the body, and I had to go look it up, but there actually is such a term as muscle velocity.
Ah,
So I went and looked up acceleration according to physics, and it's basically the rate of speed based on the velocity of the mass, right? So I would looked up velocity, which is again it's based on time. So it's sort of the rate of speed that anything is done is the velocity. So there's such a term as muscular velocity, meaning how quickly or how slowly we add contraction or change contraction in the muscle. And just a side note, there happens to be an inverse relationship between the rate of speed and the amount of force.
Wow.
The greater the speed at which we contract muscles, the less force we actually generate. So we're
Well, that
weaker
makes sense.
when we're quick to grab those reins. We're a whole lot weaker
Whoa.
than if we use our muscles slowly, or even a leg aid. I think that's why a slower leg aid is not only more easily felt by the horse, but has a little more power.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I was bodybuilding, another great thing I got
Mhm.
into, people thought lifting heavy and fast would get them bigger muscles. When actually, if you lower the weight and you focus and concentrate on that movement, you build much more mass.
Same with horses.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, one of the sort of um, challenges with horses I get that have had dressage training is that same thought that you want to go faster to have more force to create lift and build muscle, that you want to go faster and quicker and have the resistance of more leverage on the bit or a strong rein contact to help
Wow.
them
Okay.
lift. So it's sort of similar
It
in
is.
if we think in terms of just how forces are managed, it's very similar to what you were just describing with bodybuilding. So it's actually when the horse has more has a balance between the braking and pushing forces is what actually creates more vertical force in the spine. So the pushing can exceed the braking can exceed the pushing. The back muscles have to balance those forces of motion. So pushing is the accelerator, and braking, just like the brakes in our car, is a resistant force to acceleration. But the way we ride when we're trying to slow a horse down or stop is we create the forces of reverse.
Right.
So a lot of, and that's just human instinct. It's what we all do on the back of a
We're
horse
very
because
grabby.
are very grabby, handsy. And we think if the horse is running away with us that way, we need to create an opposing force.
Oh,
Good
sounds
luck.
like a cartoon to me.
There's lots of cartoons that demonstrate that very well. Because then the horse suddenly stops and we go flying the other way.
Been there, done that.
Oh, which brings us to the law of inertia. finally, finally, I get to Newton's first law, which is the law of inertia. So the laws of motion really describe why objects move or don't move as they do. Like that's all physics is really trying to explain. And the better we understand it, the more predictable certain things become. We understand why one technique worked or didn't work. We start to understand that we can give a strong aid or a light aid that is unique to the very horse we're riding in that moment.
Mhm.
The amount of force we use is dependent on the amount of force we're coping with, right? When we give an aid to a horse. And some riders sort of like each human will have a preference. Some people like being kind of firm and heavy. Some people
Mhm.
like being really light, but the horse has its own opinion or its own needs as to what helps the horse manage whatever disruption to that forward and up force that's happening.
Do you find that what I'm finding with my horses as I continue to fine tune optimal balance is that it can even change in the horse? I mean, you might, I'm finding my aids are extremely light.
Oh, well, exactly. So the same as you in massage, the amount, because when you're massaging, you're generating force
Mhm.
against the body of the person, right? So how much force do you have to use on one person compared to another?
I call it a tissue issue.
So describe a tissue issue. What is
A
that?
tissue issue. I think it's that, and I wonder if it's the same for riders. I think it is. You have to be coming from a place of intention, and really be tactily knowledgeable about what's underneath your hands.
That's the
Because
same
like
for
you said,
riders. Mhm.
yeah, like you said, as a massage therapist, some people like what I call fluff massages. And being an orthopedic massage therapist and working with fascia, some of it's not very light work.
Right.
So, you've got to find, and each time a person comes to you, whether it's Alexander, Riders, massage, they could be in a totally different state than they were the last time you worked with them.
Exactly. So the same person, just like a horse, the same person can feel very differently on the table over time.
Exactly.
Some getting worse, some getting better. But when you talk about sort of the knowledgeable sense of touch, when you put your hands on someone, how do you know if they have a tight muscle that or an issue, a tissue issue with fascia?
Issue.
Yes. What is
Um,
it that you feel? Because
it's
again,
the integrity of what I feel under my hands. And I don't know how to explain that. It's the same thing working as an Alexander teacher, putting hands on and knowing if I put my hands on, say, the back of someone's neck, I can feel whether they're pulling their head back or forward without looking at them. There's just a tactile, and we talked about this last time in the umwelt,
mm-hmm,
that tactileness of the horse, especially around where our legs are,
is
is
so high.
extreme. It's so high that um, we're just screaming at them.
Yes. Yes.
But I don't know how, and I think it is that intention. It comes from thought first, because if you have an end goal to finish a massage in 50 minutes, or is your thought, how do I help this person get out of pain? Let's say those two opposing thoughts. Your intention during that 50 minutes is totally different, your thought. So therefore the information you're receiving or giving is different.
Mm. No, and as a rider, because working with balance in the horse, especially centered around understanding and guiding the spine into better coordination according to its mechanical design, you start to feel as a rider that the work is sort of like slow motion body work.
Mhm.
And I can feel on a horse where they're tight, so to speak, or have chronic tension because I get excessive force that seems to be stored somehow muscularly. It's not a moving, flowing force. It's like, and I feel it as pressure against my body. So it's a force that's trying to push my body out of a vertical alignment with gravity or destabilize my sort of quiet stability. And that force acting against my body, I can almost pinpoint from the feel in the saddle. Is it coming from the front end or the back end? Is it coming from the left or right? Do I feel it pushing me up or pulling me down? Do I feel, pulling me left or pulling me right? And if we think of muscles are what increase acceleration and the body is the mass, then we're constantly playing with mass times acceleration, generating force. So
Yes.
where I feel the forces is how I develop the tactile sense that you're talking about, like
Mm-hmm.
what you feel in your hands when you feel a body, those spots that where the muscle maybe doesn't feel supple, or you feel more resistant force when you manipulate it with your hands. I think that's how we learn through the sense of touch what the body is doing or the habits of movement or where the problems are. Is that your experience as well with
Yeah. And I think it's difficult for riders because we are so grabby with our hands. We think these are magic. Whereas, like you were saying, the organization of the spine, and when we're a rider, we're getting that information from a different place. And we may not be keying into that through our seat bones or whatever you want to call it. That information you feel high or low or being dumped one direction or the other. I think that's it's a fine art that you acquire.
Although it kind of comes back to what you said about when you work on people, what's your intention?
Right.
Right. So if your intention, because the way we're trained to think as riders is number one, all of our aids are meant to sort of move body parts around in the horse
Wow.
or elicit a response, like a condition response, like a cue, right?
Right.
Or kind of the upper level understanding of aids is that we're moving body parts around to get the skeleton in the right coordination. The other way we think of riding that really hinders our ability to feel and work with just the forces is that we have the concept that the rider puts the horse together. And I go, the more I
Wow.
learned about actual biomechanics, the more complex it becomes. It doesn't get simpler. It becomes more and more and more complex. Any moving body, living body, is a really complex system. And so when you massage somebody, you can go in and maybe alleviate pain, maybe change muscle tone. But like you said, when they get up and start moving, the habits of movement are still there. Whereas with Alexander technique, you're working primarily with direction of forces. At
Oh,
least
I like that. I'm
my
going to have to use
lessons.
that one.
Well, every lesson, every AT lesson I've ever had is like really intentionally organizing the directions of the motion and then letting the body organize to that direction.
I like that. I'm glad we're recording this. But that terminology could also be used as a rider.
Well, absolutely. That's
Yeah,
why,
changing that thought to that instead of, if I put the horse here, I get the right answer.
right,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. And that it has to be a change in what we're thinking about when we ride. So if we think we put the horse together, there's no rider on the planet that is going to organize the specific mechanical coordination of the spine better than the horse will for itself. There's no way a human can do it better than the horse discovers in the process of training. There's just no way. I don't care how well you ride or what level you ride at. It's a physical improbability.
Well, I tell you what, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears if you try to do it that way.
Oh yeah, and you can spend a lot of time for very small results. The other thing we have to let go of is that our aids move body parts. And by that, I mean a headset, lifting the shoulders, controlling the shoulders, moving the hind legs,
Oh, wow.
bringing the hind legs deeper, lifting the back. It's like that's why we resort to spurs and more leverage, is because when we think in terms of moving body parts on a 1,000-pound animal, we expect heaviness.
Oh, that's true. We expect it to be hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that construct in our head, just like you said, looking at how do I think about my aids, or because yes, we're going to give aids, we're going to use our seat, we're going to use our legs, we're going to use our reins, no matter how you ride or at what level. That's what all riders have in common across the board is we have a seat, a leg, legs, and reins. And how we use them is what makes a difference. And it isn't even dependent on the right bit, the right reins, the right saddle. It just has to be not creating pain for the horse and allowing the horse to move comfortably. But other than that, the tools we use are really inert. They don't generate force on their own.
I wish they did.
I know. So it always makes me laugh when people go, my saddle keeps slipping to the left or to the right. And I go, does it do that when you have it in the tack room? Like to blame the saddle somehow, right? And I go, it's just human nature, but it's pretty funny because I go, the saddle doesn't move on its own. So either the rider is creating the problem or the horse's back is creating the problem with unequal forces from left to right, or it's a combination of the two. But it's not the saddle.
No. Or the footing.
Right.
Or the farrier or the
Right. And I think we've kind of been going on a little while. I want to just review the 3 laws of motion today and maybe the next couple of meetings, because this is when riders can start to think, and you can say how this relates to just our everyday use of our own bodies. But with horses and riders, when we can start to understand that every time we contract a muscle, we're creating the acceleration within our own mass, and that's generating force. Force always has direction and magnitude. So how magnitude is how much, how little, and direction is, every point in a 360-degree bubble, right? There's a million potential directions in there that are very specific. So when we can start to think and understand the laws of motion and come back to our horse with the thought that our aids channel and direct forces. So every time one of the vertebrae moves millimeters under the saddle in the thoracolumbar spine that we sit over, we straddle, when you have tiny little articulations through the spine, it generates forces within the movement. So every movement of the mechanics generates a force. So instead of thinking we have to manipulate body parts, we can help the horse organize forces, which then guide the body towards the best function of the mechanics.
Yeah, and it's the same with people. It all starts with the organization of the spine.
Yes.
Not the legs.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, if you get that organization in the spine, then the legs and the arms can do what they need to do.
Absolutely.
And I think people go the opposite.
Yes, with horses as well as our own bodies. Yes, but the spine, which houses the central nervous system, dictates all movement. And dysfunction in the spine is never going to be huge. Like to have a compressed disc, how far do the bones of the spine or the vertebra have to squish too far together?
Not much.
Millimeters.
Yeah.
I mean, they measure it in millimeters. And when we have a compressed disc, a blown disc, a back issue, back pain, spinal arthritis, it is debilitating. debilitating to our movement. And it can be a whole lot of pain. And that there's a ton of stuff online, studies of how the Alexander technique helps, even if you have to have back surgery. Some people were able to forego back surgery by learning how to better control the function of their spine, and other people recovered faster by, it's just like with a horse with an injury or a lameness issue, you might have to call in the doctor or the vet to alleviate pain.
Right.
As long as there's pain, the body can't find correct movement. It's going to be in a protective mode. But once the pain has been addressed, there's still the habit of how the body organized forces of motion, which aren't always balanced or kind of clear in the direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're not like the word we use, optimal. We're not optimizing the system to the best of its capability.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean with optimal balance, and what you mean with optimal posture is that we are, and we do it without stress, without risking further injury, doing it the wrong way, all of those sort of pitfalls. We can think of the way we do that is by managing the forces of motion and channeling them in a direction through our aids or our conscious awareness, rather than just getting the job done.
The
right?
goal, meeting the goal. It's
right. So explain, like, one of the big things with Alexander work is getting up and down out of a chair, how you sit, right? Which I never thought of that before I did an Alexander lesson. But I think you sent me a diagram one time that showed like all these arrows that
arrows of
arrows
optimal.
of force.
Arrows of the forces. Yeah.
So when we do it in a poor habit of movement or with spinal dysfunction, the arrows that sort of show like the head tilting back, the neck shortening, the back arching, the sort of pulling effort of coming up out of a chair, all those arrows of force were going multiple directions. And then the ideal illustration was we sort of keep the integrity of our spine straight, lean forward from the hip joint, and can push off from our feet, create the resistance through the feet and the legs rather than arching and contorting the spine. And I just always found that so interesting because it's describing the same thing.
The horses do the same thing.
So instead of like when we're in poor mechanical use, the result of that is forces that dissipate in multiple directions away from actually where we want to go.
And that usually is in a muscular efforting, tension, going down to that pain.
It can even be stress or strain on any joint in your body.
Yes.
Tendon, ligaments, excessive and chronic muscular contraction in a horse. It tells me right off the bat, even before I see the horse move, if I see a whole lot of excessive muscular contraction or feel it with my hands, that already tells me that the spine is not stable during motion. Because without the axial skeleton finding stability in motion, the muscles have to use excessive energy in order to stabilize the entire body during motion, because the primary line of the body is not stable. So I go, you can feel it when you massage a person. You probably feel it when you do Alexander technique, and I feel it when I ride horses.
Yeah. Yeah, you can. And in movement is where I think you can really see it, feel it more than stationary. I mean, you can kind of get a grasp, but as soon as you get a body moving, that's when you can identify
where
how
the
out of
forces
balance,
are going.
where the forces are going
Yeah.
or not.
Yeah, and that's the whole idea behind optimal balance or optimal posture, is that well organized forces of motion in coalescing into a specific direction are more efficient and sort of equal the idea of correct or most ideal use, functional use of the body mechanics. So instead of having to sort of manually adjust body mechanics through body work or riding, we can think of directing and channeling the forces of motion, and then the body is guided towards its most ideal mechanical function. So it's a different way to think about it, but that's why Newton's laws of motion, I think, are so important for riders to really understand and relate to. I feel them. I work with them every single day I'm on a horse.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tangible part of the riding experience.
Yeah.
And some people will say, well, I can't feel this or I can't feel that. And I go, but you feel something, because there's no getting away from the forces of motion. You can't get away from them. They're affecting your body every stride of every ride.
Yes. And if you think of it, if the rider isn't already aware and using themselves optimally,
They're going to have a hard time.
not only that, but what is that? What, because of the law of physics and forces, what are we transmitting to the horse
Exactly.
at that point?
So I'm going to go just make a quick, well, how do I want to do this? I wanted to review quickly the Newton's three laws of motion, but what you just said made me think of the law of inertia, the first law, that states an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction, unless acted upon by an unbalanced force.
Bingo.
That unbalanced force could be the rider.
It could be. Oh, duh.
I know, right?
And I see it when I'm bodybuilding. We have a dominant side. When, say, people are using machines, say a sled, they're pushing with their legs, that dominant leg is going to take on most of the load.
Yes.
So we're taking that information to the horse.
Yes. And it's exactly what leads to, it sort of precipitates injury.
I agree.
Or leads to what we call with horses idiopathic lameness, that is just really small repetitive damage that adds up, small repetitive misuses that sort of add up over time and develop pathology.
Yeah, people too.
Yep.
Same thing.
And that's why working on balance or correct mechanical motion really facilitates the health of the body.
Yes.
And when all forces are balanced, it's like it's more energy efficient.
Oh, it's so much easier.
So much easier. Right. And we will get into that next time, talking about the law of inertia, because I talk about the law of inertia in at least one lesson a week with horses and riders. I go, that comes up all the time. So I want to actually do maybe a whole podcast just on that, because
Okay.
It's one of the things as riders we feel the most, and it destabilizes us the most. So the Newton's three laws of motion are: one, the law of inertia, which, like I said, states that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Number 2, mass times acceleration equals net force. All right, so force is a vector of mass times acceleration, always coupled with direction and magnitude. So mass times the second law, mass times acceleration equals net force, pertains to the behavior of an object for which all existing forces are not balanced. So law number 1 sort of assumes if all the forces are balanced and equal, then that's how an
It'll
object,
stay.
right, stays at
Yeah.
rest or stays in motion at the same speed, same direction. But when you have unbalanced forces, right, that's when the, what did I write? I think I wrote down the acceleration of an object as produced by a net force is directly proportional to the magnitude of the net force in the same direction as the net force, and inversely, here they are, hang on, and inversely proportional to the mass of the object. So net force is the sum of all forces that are interacting at the same time. So when we, like, let's say, for example, if we move as a rider with, say, maybe the theory of move with the horse. So we're kind of not only allowing the horse to move our body, but we're actually putting some muscular effort into the movement ourselves. We are generating extra force for the horse to cope with during
Yes.
every stride. Right. And then the third law of motion, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. That forces always come in pairs, equal with equal force and opposing directions. So a force is a push or a pull that acts upon an object as a result of its interaction with another object. And we'll get in more, well, like that might be a little bit too cerebral for a lot of riders, but what I want to do is get in there and talk about what each law sort of means to us as riders, learn how to cope with it with the thought of managing forces of motion rather than manipulating the mechanics or kind of cajoling a horse into a frame using our aids, right?
Yep.
Drive the hind end forward into the bit and make a frame, right? Those are still very, very common ideas out there, just like stand up straight to have a good posture.
Don't get me started.
I knew that would kind of, I just struck the match. Go, Deb.
Don't get me started.
Because that's, I mean, you can see where it's not entirely wrong, but it sort of misses the point almost entirely when we say we want to put a horse in a frame, right? Make them square and round. We can only do that on horses.
What?
I know.
What?
I know.
And round. Make
We'll
you
get into
square
that
and
when we
round.
talk.
Put you in a box, but stay round.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
But in human terms, what are some of the postural directives that actually kind of work against optimal posture?
Like, what do you mean?
Well, the only one that came to my mind was the idea of stand up straight. We tend to take a military stance.
Right. That's been
thrusting.
it's all in the language. Another Alexander teacher and I that taught in an elementary school, we changed that to, can you stand or sit up soft and tall? That has a totally different meaning. So the stand up straight, heels down, shoulders back.
Right.
All of that, it's not, the result is not necessarily wrong. It's how are we getting there?
Or what goes through your mind? Because you're affectionately called by many of us the posture police.
The posture Nazi.
The posture police are here. So we call you the posture police because we just watch you cringe. Or you say something out loud when we go into our habits, you know. And so what is it that you see when you see somebody just jogging in a way that isn't going to help the health of their body, or like taking horses out of the equation? It could be like, what comes to my mind is somebody really thinking they're getting a workout with power walking, you know, or jogging kind of at the expense of their knees.
I think that, that's a whole podcast within itself, but it's that thought of they have to arrive at a destination, but not being concerned about how are they using themselves to get there.
Mm. The end goal becomes more important than the process of getting to the goal.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that happens. I think that's just kind of a human thing. That's just an easy way for us to think. We tend to think if we get the job done, then how we got the job done doesn't matter that much. The means justifies the end, or the end
Right.
justify. I think I said that backwards. The end justifies the means. But when it comes to a body, that doesn't work as well.
Not for long.
Not for
Not for
long.
long.
No, and I hear it all the time with riders or about the horse, or just people who aren't even involved with horses, that the small, repetitive, sort of dysfunctional use of the body over time, we attribute it to just getting old. That we think as we age, or the horses age, that function becoming worse or painful or uncomfortable is a natural part of the aging process. You know, and I've seen so many, like I watch dancers or yoga instructors or the older AT instructors who have been doing this a long time. They don't age and lose a quality of fluidness and athleticness to their movement. They don't become sort of like look like they have rusty joints like the Tin Man. So I go, I don't think there is a direct correlation between sort of fluid movement or ease of motion or pain-free motion and aging. Like I don't think that there's a correlation directly between age and the way we move.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a story about an Alexander teacher in her 80s that her exercise every day was to appropriately pick up her lawnmower and set it on the bench, and then take it off the bench and put it on the ground.
Interesting. That's weightlifting. Yeah, and at 80 years old, you would think no woman could lift a lawnmower.
There you go.
Yeah. Even the little rotary kind that don't weigh too much.
Right. They're
The
just
little
awkward.
hand push mowers. Yeah. And hope you don't.
Awkward.
Exactly. No, that's fascinating. And I saw a video, you guys will have to search for it on YouTube, but it was a singer, the one that did Hey Mickey in the 80s. I can't think of her name. Tony Basil. That's it. Tony Basil is a singer. And I think she's over 70, maybe in her 80s, but there's a video floating around of her dancing, and she looks amazing. Amazing dancing around. So you can Google or search on YouTube for Tony Basil dancing. And there's some old stuff that comes up from her younger days, but there's some current stuff with where she is now that is, you know, what we would consider an elderly woman hip hopping with the best of them. I mean, just really looking fluid and cool dancing on this video. So I think that's enough for today, but let's get into these Newton's laws of motion over the next couple of podcasts. We'll start with the law of inertia, then we'll talk about mass times acceleration equals net force. And then also for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and what those laws mean to us day to day in managing our own physical use, and for horses and riders trying to find balance in motion. But they're kind of big topics. So
Yeah, they are.
today, I think a lot of riders still don't even equate what they're doing on a horse with any laws of physics or motion. Like that's
No.
kind of not even in the bandwidth of most riders. So
It's ride to the letter A, get around that barrel or get over that jump.
it's so much of the thinking is still on like conditioned response,
Yes.
cues and reward, obedience, you know,
Mhm.
and if you advance, then maybe you start to think about the movement, but the thinking about the movement becomes putting the horse in the right movement through
Mhm.
leverage, or manipulating, trying to move around body parts to get the job done. So just to plant the seed in this podcast that understanding the laws of motion and managing the forces of motion through the use of our body and our aids is such a quiet, enjoyable, beautiful way to work with a horse.
Yes, I
And
agree.
and after talking about Umwelt last podcast and the level of tactile sensitivity that a horse has, they prefer when we ride with less force or generate less chaos of force
Mhm.
than when we ride quietly.
I
So
agree.
this is how we learn to ride quietly, is with just the simple thought that we are channeling and directing the forces of motion, not the body parts,
Right.
not the mass of the horse, which instantly makes us think about giving heavy aids.
Yeah, it does. Or tensing and shortening.
Yes.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. But I wanted to kind of get that thought out there in the horse universe, that there might be a different way of thinking about how we have contacts and aids and develop good mechanical use of the horse through the laws of motion, through force management.
Cool.
All right, my dear.
All
I think
right.
we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
Please like, subscribe, comment. You can ask questions in the comments or post anything that you would like, that you have questions on or would like to hear discussed. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks.
Be kind.